I came home from work a couple of days ago and went straight to my bedroom to relax. My wife had told me earlier that she was going to be out for a while because a friend had come into town and she was going to meet her for a few drinks. I kicked off my shoes and laid out on my bed for a moment. It didn't alarm me when I heard the front door open because I thought it was my wife coming home. I heard some footsteps come down the hallway and then they just stopped. Expecting my wife to come through the door at any second, I waited for her to enter. A few moments must have passed and nothing happened. Slightly confused, I got up to check on where she was since I never heard her walk away or anything. To give you an idea of how the house is laid out, let me explain. When you come in through the front door, it opens up directly into the living room. Through that, there is a long hallway with a bathroom immediately to the right, an office past that to the left, and then the bedroom. In the hallway is the pull-down stairs to the attic. I checked the office first, and no one was there. Same thing in the bathroom. The door was open and clearly had no one in it. The kitchen is to the left of the living room, and it was empty as well. It wasn't until I was heading back to the bedroom that it occurred to me that the footsteps sounded to stop right around where the attic is. I was hesitant at first to check it out. Plenty of stories filled my mind of people secretly living in someone's house in the attic, and it scared me to think that something like that might be happening. It was then that my wife came home. I explained what had happened, and she was a little freaked out. She didn't want me to call the cops, however, just in case I had been half asleep or something and imagined the whole thing. We stood there for a bit, listening to see if we heard anything else. Finally, I told her I was going to look because it was ridiculous to just stand there. She pulled out her phone and I grabbed a baseball bat just in case. With a quick pull, the stairs to the attic slid down. Carefully, I went up. My wife stayed down below, ready to make a phone call if needed. What I saw when I got up there still has me shaking. Spray painted on the walls were the words, "I come when you are alone." There was nobody found up there, and my wife called the police as soon as she heard me scream. There is a window in the attic, and it was open. From what they can determine, some weirdo just walked into my house, spray painted my walls, and then left out the window. To think that someone had the balls to enter my home, knowing I was there and at 4:30 in the afternoon is mind-blowing. How they got out still confuses me as well. It's a 20-foot drop, and there was no ladder for them to climb down. We are staying in a hotel until we can sell the place, and neither one of us will go to the house alone. We always tell kids not to talk to strangers or to take candy from people they don't know. We tell women to be aware of their surroundings so they don't get hurt. As a full-grown man who stands 6 feet tall and weighs around 200 pounds, it never really occurred to me that I could be in any real danger in the middle of the day in a quiet neighborhood. That all changed one sunny afternoon. I was working as a door-to-door salesman, not the most glamorous job, I know, but after the army, I took any work I could get to get on my feet again. Not many people were home that day and business was not doing well. I was walking down the sidewalk when I noticed a yellow car. Looked like something from the 50s, but I can't really remember. It was driving down the street slowly and the driver was looking around. I figured he was probably lost and didn't pay him any attention until he stopped next to me and said hello. I said hello back and he took off again. He kind of looked a little greasy, but besides that, nothing to be scared of. He was a pudgy, probably late 30s, early 40s, and balding with a bad comb over. Since he was seated, I couldn't tell how tall he was, but he kind of had a squished-in face with piercing blue weasel eyes, if that makes any sense. I remember he wore a shirt and tie as well. It was a block or two later when he came up from behind. This time he stopped and asked if I lived around the area. I told him no and he took off again. Now, I found that odd, but since he didn't cause me any harm, I ignored it. I saw him turn the corner and go out of sight. By the time I hit the end of the block, he was back. This time, when he stopped, he asked if I knew anyone in the area. I told him no. And then he asked what I was doing there. I told him I was working. He then asked for directions to a place that wasn't even near where we were. This confused me. Why had he asked if I lived in the area or knew anyone nearby if he was looking for somewhere not even close? I should mention this happened in 2004, so smartphones weren't really a thing or what they are nowadays. Most people had flip phones and no 3 or 4G, no access to Google Maps. If you wanted to find a place, you either had to be able to read an actual map or have MapQuest directions printed off. Well, I gave him directions to where he wanted to go, but he told me he wouldn't be able to remember that. I didn't have a pen and paper on me, and he didn't have one either. He asked if I would drive with him to the place, and then he would drive me back to drop me off, then drive back the way I showed him. That just sounded ridiculous to me, and I told him I wouldn't go. He begged a bit, and then told me he would make it worth my while. I didn't like the sound of that, and the way the guy was looking at me made me feel uneasy. Might have just been those weasel eyes I mentioned earlier, though. Finally, he relented and drove away. I couldn't stop thinking about how weird it was with all the questions and the way it felt like he was stalking me. Then I thought more about it and realized that my size wouldn't have mattered if I'd gotten into the car and he had a gun. There wouldn't have been much I could have done in a closed-in space like that with a pistol to me. I mean, it could have been nothing at all, just a really strange guy. But it could have also been a full-on Jeffrey Dahmer situation. I'm just glad I never got in to find out. Growing up, my family didn't have much money, and we lived on the bad side of town. Drug house on every block, police raids on houses at least once a week, that kind of stuff. It wasn't unusual to see people half out of their minds walking around at any time during the day. There are so many stories I could tell you that would freak you out if you have never been in that kind of situation before. For me though, most of the stuff was perfectly normal. There is one, however, that even I can't get over. Mom had just gotten us from the bus stop after school. We weren't allowed to walk anywhere without a parent, not even the block from the bus stop. Well, we were walking when an old grizzled man approached us. I had seen his type before, methed out and sores all over his face. Probably would remind you of a zombie with all the scabs and oozing wounds he had. He crossed the street and at first was just talking to no one, kind of to himself. I don't think my mom even heard him. You get used to tuning things out with all the crazies around. He was mumbling some stuff as he got closer. Then he got really mad and started yelling. He accused my mom of ignoring him, that she was too good to talk to him. She quickly reached into her pocket and pulled out some cash, hoping that would get the guy to leave us alone. He smacked her hand and the money went flying down the street. The man started going off about how he only wanted some common human decency and not her whore money. At least I think that's what he said. It was hard to understand him with his mouth full of broken teeth. He didn't threaten to hurt us, but he followed us down the street yelling and berating my mom. As soon as we got into the house, she broke down in tears. The man stayed outside, shouting at the top of his lungs. After a bit, he started throwing things. If the windows didn't have bars on them, they would have been broken. This went on for about 15 minutes, and Mom didn't know what to do. It was useless to call the police in that neighborhood. If it wasn't for a raid, they never showed up. Anyways, he kept shouting and throwing things at the house. I was looking out the window, even though Mom had told me not to. And this is the part I won't forget. While this man was shouting, a younger man came out from the house across the street. It all happened like in slow motion, like in the movies. The old man didn't hear him coming, but the young one pulled out a gun when he was about 5 feet away from the old one. He came up right next to him and pulled the trigger. Brains went flying halfway down the street and the old man hit the ground dead. The young man looked around and then just went right back inside his house like nothing happened. It shakes me to the core how casual the young one was about it. It was like he had just taken out the trash. That was the first and hopefully last time I ever see anyone get murdered. I've since moved up in the world and can say I live in a nice neighborhood now. That event definitely inspired me to make something of myself. This happened just last year. I was out in the woods hiking on a warm spring day. I often like to go out by myself so I can think and be alone. It was a new area I had never been to before, so I wasn't familiar with the surroundings, but that was the point. I wanted something new to explore. Anyways, I was hiking out there for a good few hours, deep in the backcountry, when all of a sudden I heard a high-pitched, ear-piercing scream. It echoed around the countryside, and initially I couldn't figure out which way it had come from. The second time it happened, it seemed to be coming from my left, over a hill on the other side of a ravine. The brush was pretty thick in that direction, but curiosity got the better of me and I had to find out what was making that sound. So I cinched up my pack and made my way down the ravine and over the hill. On the approach up the hill, the smell of smoke began to fill my nose. Now, my original thought was that maybe a forest fire had started and the screams had been a camper or a person that accidentally started it. But right before I reached the top, I not only smelled smoke, but something god-awful. I'm sure most of you have accidentally burnt hair before. That's what it smelled like. Finally, I crested the hill, and when I looked down, I couldn't believe my eyes. In a clearing in the woods, there were about 10 or 12 people in robes. Each one of them had their faces painted blue and wore some sort of odd headdress. They were circling a bonfire in the middle of their group, chanting, and one of them had a pole that they were swinging back and forth. If that wasn't crazy enough, I saw in the fire, tied to a large log, what appeared to be a human burning in the flames. I couldn't help it. I cried out in surprise and shock. The whole group stopped what they were doing and stared at me. Once I realized what I had done, I turned and ran as fast as I could. Down the hill in leaps and bounds I went. How my feet didn't get caught in the brambles beyond me. Still, I had to make it up the other side of the ravine, which would leave me exposed. Instead of doing that, I decided to stay in the ditch and run as far as I could. Honestly, I don't think they even gave chase, but I didn't realize that until I had ran for about an hour. Since I didn't go back the way I came, it took me about a day to make it out of the forest. It was a nightmare the whole time. Every sound, every snap of a twig, or even animal had me on edge. When I got back to town, I told the police what I had seen. They sent out a search party and found the fire, but there was no body. The ashes were sifted and some human DNA was discovered, but they were too destroyed to make any kind of match. There were tracks from about 15 different people that they collected. A few days after I told the police what had happened and they went out to search, I got a call from someone saying that they were a detective and asked me to come down to the station to give more information. All he told me was that they had found a few things. Pretty much what I just told you. There was something about the prints. He couldn't tell me what it was over the phone. When I went down to the station, he never showed up. All the clerk told me was that he no longer worked there. Way too coincidental to not be significant. But if they made a detective disappear, what would they do to me? That's why I never went to the media. I may even be putting myself in danger discussing it here. Even if that is the case, I had to put it out there. It's been chewing me up. I took my kids to the fair this summer. For our small town, it's a pretty big event, and there are always lots of people that go. My children range from 15 to 5 years of age. The older two I don't have a problem letting them run off by themselves, but the two younger ones had to stay by me. To make it worse, this summer there had been a string of child abductions in town. To say I was on high alert would be an understatement. Even then, you can't always see everything all the time, especially in a crowd with hundreds of people around. Anyways, we got there and my youngest seemed to understand when I told him to stay close. For most of the day, he was right by my side. It wasn't until my older son, who was 8, wanted to look at something that the 5-year-old decided to run off. It was 1 second. I turned my head for 1 second, and when I looked back, he was gone. Naturally, I freaked out, grabbed my 8-year-old, and went to look for the other one. Frantically, I plunged into the crowd calling his name. No one stopped to help. No one even seemed to notice, which intensified my feelings of being lost and afraid. It took about 5 minutes, but it felt like forever when my 8-year-old yelled out, "There he is!" I looked to where he was pointing and I saw my youngest son holding the hand of a strange man. He was tall and probably weighed over 300 pounds. He had long matted black hair and wore jeans and a t-shirt. I yelled out for my youngest son in desperation. The man didn't even turn around to look at me. He let go of my boy's hand and hurriedly walked off into the crowd. I didn't get a good look at his face to even give the police a description. I tried to chase him down, but with everyone in town at the fair, it was hard to fight through a few thousand people. My son told me that he had walked off to look at another ride, and then this guy told him he was a friend of mine and that he would take him to me. I was a little upset that my youngest hadn't asked for the password, but he is only 5. I was more relieved that nothing bad happened to him. I'm a good parent, I really am, but this made me feel terrible. I hope others don't judge me too harshly. I am definitely reconsidering my stance on those child leash things.